Christian County Library presents Discovering Hemingway Through In Our Time, a discussion about the life and craft of American writer Ernest Hemingway, as revealed through one of his short story collections. Joining us is Dr. Tyler Blake, professor of English at Mid-America Nazarene University in Kansas City, Missouri. All right, Dr. Blake, thank you for partnering with Christian County Library today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor.
So Ernest Hemingway was an American writer who lived during the first half of the 20th century. He's been described by literary critics as having an economical and understated style to his writing, and he strongly influenced writing through his 7 novels, 6 short story collections, and then his 2 nonfiction works. Eventually, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. Also, though, his adventurous lifestyle and multiple marriages have intrigued readers for decades, apart from his writing. So with all that in mind, let's jump into some of the stories from In Our Time, a short story collection by Hemingway, and we can discover more about him.
All right. Sounds great.
All right. So number one, first question we had for you concerns the short story Indian Camp. So in this short story, how does this story reflect Hemingway's childhood? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I think it's a great story to use to introduce Hemingway's life because, like many of his stories, he wrote from his experience. And Nick Adams is often said to be Hemingway. And In Our Time is a Bildungsroman where you see little Nick as a child grow into a man and go off to war, it looks like, and then try to deal with the after effects of war. And I think Indian Camp is a great story of initiation of a little boy being exposed to things that parents would probably rather he not be exposed to, but that as a young boy he did see, because his father was a doctor and did work with the local Native Americans there in Upper Michigan. And so he may well have seen something similar to this. So, and just the nature aspects, being outdoors in a boat, going out into the woods, all those kinds of things are all in this story. But I just think it's a great initiation story.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree. What would you say the story says then about life and death? You mentioned that Nick kind of experiences some things to, transition his life into adulthood, into manhood. So what does it say about life and death?
That's a good question. I think one thing it says is that death is inevitable, because in the story at one point, after the man kills himself on the way back in the boat, little Nick asks his father, is dying hard? And he said, I don't think so, Nick. And he says, is everybody going to die? And he asks him questions like that. And then the story ends with Nick saying he knew that he would not die. So he's not fully initiated yet, because he still feels like death is not going to be a part of his experience. He still associates it with the people that he saw at the Indian camp. Mm-hmm. Kind of what you see in Faulkner. The kids think that only the servants die and that they won't, because they're different on a different hierarchy.
Right.
So anyway, I think it says that death is inevitable, but that there is joy to be found in life, and also lots of pain, of course, in life as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I mean, we do have to accept death because that is, like you said, part of life. It's going to happen. But like you said, while we're alive, to live, kind of to that fullest. Do you think, is that what Nick, the character learns from this? And then, like you mentioned, Nick kind of being a stand-in for Hemingway in many ways. Mm-hmm. Do you think like Hemingway then understood that, or
Well, I do think that he wrote this at a time when he was just becoming a father, and you see the difficulties. He was never a great father. He always struggled with trying to be the kind of father he knew he should be, I think. And this story is one of the many in the collection that shows the pain associated with childbirth from the very beginning. And it's so painful for the father in the story that while they're delivering the baby, he kills himself. And that's sort of the horrible twist in the story that nobody sees coming. The first time you read it, you think, oh no, he's dead. He killed himself.
Right.
And I think it expresses some of Hemingway's sentiments about fatherhood. And it was not easy for him.
Oh, for sure, for sure. No, that's an interesting idea. And then, of course, the play there between um, life and death, like in that very scene, new life coming and then someone dying, taking his own life. It's kind of an interesting concept there.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you for that. The second story that we wanted to discuss was the short story called The End of Something.
Mhm.
So with this short story, how does Hemingway achieve his goal of being honest and truthful? Like, where does that come into this story?
Well, it's a breakup story, and so Nick has aged some. I think he's probably a teenager, maybe 14 or 15 in this story, and he has a girlfriend named Marge, and they go fishing together, and unbeknownst to her, he breaks up with her while they're there. And I just think the whole scene of the breakup rings true. Like Hemingway doesn't cheat. He doesn't have his characters say things that people that age wouldn't say. Like when she asks why we're breaking up, he says it isn't fun anymore,
Mhm.
which says so much. But it seems to me like something someone that age would say in a breakup.
For sure. And definitely speaks to the nature of relationships when you're that age.
Yes.
It is more about fun and, discovering new things and getting to know people. It's not so serious, maybe as like a relationship later on in your life
Mm-hmm.
can
Mm-hmm.
be.
Like the same emotions, the same kind of pain, that never goes away when, like the title says, it's the end of something. That's never fun.
No, for sure, for sure. Even yeah, no matter what the weight of it is. Like I was saying, if it's a kind of a light, more frivolous relationship when you're young, or if it's maybe more uh, serious, like when you're older, there's more serious elements to it. Either way, like you said, it is the end of something, and that's always kind of you're mourning that a little bit.
Yeah.
So how does he make this breakup story then, like poignant and artistic in that way?
Well, it has a lot of mythical elements in it. Like they go out in a boat, which is the same thing you see in Indian camp, and it calls to mind, ancient archetypal passages crossing the river Styx, crossing the river Jordan, and so they cross over together, and it's just a beautiful scene that Hemingway portrays so well, as he always does when he is describing something he loves, which I don't know of anything he loved more than nature. And so you can really feel how much he appreciates the surroundings there in Michigan. And you feel like you're there almost. And so here we are in this beautiful setting, but a sad, poignant occasion that most people can't avoid in the same way that we can't avoid death. And you just feel this bittersweet feeling, I think, throughout. And you feel sorry for these two kids as they learn to navigate the complexities of relationships.
Mhm.
Um, so
For
it's
sure.
tense, I guess.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. So because this is a story that involves, a relationship between a man and a woman, Hemingway was known for being married multiple times. And he has had accusations of chauvinism. His treatment of women in his writing, has been explored. So, what does this story, do you think, what does this story say about that? His treatment of women in his writing, and then was he a chauvinist? Well, in real life, how does this all tie in?
Yeah, I'm sure by today's standards, he was a chauvinist and a racist and a misogynist and everything else by today's standards. But I always feel like there's a sensitivity on his part toward women, and the way I think he shows it is he's always careful to show that his male characters are not perfect.
Hmm.
And he does that in this story. At the end of the story, Nick meets up with his friend Bill, and it turns out this whole thing was a plot, and they had talked about it and planned it out, and it was very much premeditated. And so, in showing that, I think Hemingway is admitting, okay, men can be jerks, and in this story, the boy, is kind of a jerk, and she's the one we feel sympathy for. And I think people sometimes read that story and think that kid is a jerk, and therefore so was Hemingway. But
Hmm.
he didn't have to show it. He could have made it look like it was her fault and let the man get off scot free. But I just think he tries to be as fair as he can be and establish some kind of a balance there.
For sure, yeah, it's just showing the complexities in everybody, and especially in terms of a relationship. I would say that obviously that involves two people. So typically, if a relationship goes sour or just the different elements to a relationship, it's never really just one person.
Yeah.
And like the fault is not all on one person, or even a good thing happening. It's not just because of one person in that relationship. That's the very nature of being in a relationship. So
Right.
that's interesting. And I think you're right. By today's standards, it would be interesting if if Hemingway was writing today and doing all of this, how he would be received.
Yeah.
Um, it would be very, very different, I think, in many ways. Okay, so the third story that we wanted to discuss then is called Soldier's Home. So does this story mirror Hemingway's experience after the war? There's been a lot of talk about uh, his involvement in different wars and war correspondence and things like that, in Hemingway's life. So how does this story mirror, if in any way, his experience?
Yeah. I think it does mirror his life and his experience, and I also think it's the story of an entire generation. That whole jazz age generation is said to have come back from World War One completely devastated, completely blasted, without knowing what to believe in or what just happened, not knowing who to trust or where they can put their faith. And I just think that story is so beautifully rendered here in Krebs's story, because Hemingway wanted to get into the war, but for whatever reason was turned down, couldn't pass the physical. Maybe it was his eyesight, maybe it was flat feet. So he joined the Italian Red Cross and got over into Italy and Austria and drove an ambulance, and he was gravely wounded, almost died, and came back home heartbroken because he fell in love with his nurse, and also limping around and wounded, but also still kind of proud of it because he wore his uniform around town. But I think just trying to reestablish order, like you see so many times with soldiers who have been in combat, trying to get back into a complex world when you've been trained to kill, or you've been gravely wounded serving your country. And you see this in Krebs as he looks at patterns. He sits on the porch and watches people go by and thinks, wow, the styles have changed. When I went to war, girls had long hair, and now all the girls I see walk down the sidewalk have short hair. And he's just fascinated by patterns, and he tries to play his clarinet, which I think is a way to bring order, looking at the black dots on a musical score and trying to follow the key signature and the time signature. And his little sister's going to go play indoor baseball, and sports was always a way to establish order. So I think you see that in this story, that universal attempt for people to try to put things back together when the whole puzzle has just been exploded onto the floor for so many people.
Yeah, for sure. And like literally in terms of war, in terms of explosions and things like that. Um, so kind of speaking onto that then, how is this a story of a generation? So you talked about Hemingway's particular experiences, but you did mention so many, veterans coming back from wars. And we can talk about World War One, but obviously I think it's a similar story for any war, after the war is over. How do people handle it? But in terms of this story, then, how is this capturing like this post World War One generation?
Yeah, I mean, you can really see it in the religious aspects of the story. At one point, his mother tries to get him to pray, and he just can't. He's like, I can't pray. And before the war, maybe he would have prayed with his mother, or maybe she wouldn't have asked him to pray because maybe she thought there's not this dire need to have him pray right now. But he just can't. And you get the feeling he's speaking for a generation who says, I'm not sure I believe that stuff anymore that you taught me before the war, because when I was in a foxhole, I prayed that nothing would happen, and all my friends got blown up, and I almost died, and it didn't. So I think that part reflects this generation's just doubt. And in the 1920s, you had the Scopes monkey trial, where Christianity went up against science, and it seemed like Christianity ever since then took a back seat and was kind of exposed for many people who suspected that perhaps it was a myth or had mythical qualities to it. And I think you see that in this poor Krebs who's trying to figure out how to go on and be a responsible, normal adult in American society.
Yeah, in this like Western society. On that, then, that makes me think, can you speak to what, in terms of Hemingway himself, did he believe? Did he have religious convictions, or did he struggle with religion through his life?
Yeah, he was raised with a very religious mother who was pretty strict about everything. In fact, I saw something today. I was reminded when she read his next novel, The Sun Also Rises, she said every page of it made me sick. So she came at it from a very moralistic Christian standpoint. And Hemingway basically rejected that. His second wife, Pauline, was Catholic, and he became a Catholic because he said he liked the order of it. And he liked how for every sin, there was a way to atone, and it was very ordered and liturgical and kind of quid pro quo compared to the Protestantism he was raised in. But I don't think he was ever truly devout in any religion.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. And like you said, the order there speaks back to this story and what you were talking about, people trying to find order. Sounds like something that Hemingway definitely was interested in doing. That was appealing to him. Okay, that's great. The next story then is called Cat in the Rain. So in this story then, what would you say the cat symbolizes?
Yeah, I love this story, and I use it in all of my classes, even my gen ed classes, because it's such a great example of how writers can use symbols. So it's a story of a young couple staying in a hotel. It's raining outside, so they're kind of stuck inside, and she sees a cat out the window, and she says, "I want that cat," and he won't go get it for her. He says, "Just get a book and read your book." And she says, "No, I want that cat. I want to have something to hold." And so to me, the cat symbolizes the child that she wants, maybe that she even wants to make with him, but he's laying on the bed upside down. His head is at the foot of the bed, if you notice, and he's reading a book, more of a cultural use of the eyes, and she's looking out the window, a natural use for the eyes. And so here's this young man with his young wife in a hotel room, and he tells her, get a book. And she's thinking about starting a family. And I think the cat symbolizes that. It's almost a surrogate for a child.
Hmm. Yeah, like you said, especially she literally says, I want something to hold, some small
Yeah.
thing. And he doesn't seem to be interested in doing that at all. So another symbol then in this story, I think, concerns the wife's hair. She talks about having short hair, but wishing that she had long hair. What is all that about? What is Hemingway trying to
Yeah.
say about that?
I love that part of the story because this was the time when women were cutting their hair in a bob. And it's hard for us to imagine today, but when that fashion first appeared, it was scandalous. And F. Scott Fitzgerald even wrote a story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair about a young woman who said, I'm tired of not getting asked out on a date. And so I'm going to cut my hair. I'm going to have a bob. And her girlfriend say, Bernice, don't do that. People will talk about you. She said, I don't even care. I'm doing it. I'm going to have a bob. And she does become popular. And
Mhm.
so eventually it's accepted as not that big of a deal, of course. But this woman in this story apparently has adopted that modern hairstyle and cut off her long Victorian matronly hair into a bob, and she regrets it. She looks in the mirror and says, I'm tired of looking like a boy. I want long hair that I can put up in a bun and feel it. And I think that's interesting that she referenced a bun, because sometimes people refer to a baby as a
Mm.
bun in the oven, and she wants something she can put her hands on and hold. And she wants long hair, which would be associated with femininity and her mother's generation,
Mm.
instead of maybe being this modern woman who travels the world with her husband who just reads books and never starts a family.
Right. Yeah. So harkening back to definitely what many people would associate to be a more traditional time with traditional gender roles and things like that. Like you said, her mother's generation. So that long hair symbolizing um, that wish, like you said, to have a family, and maybe this modernism isn't exactly what she hoped it would be.
Yeah. Yeah, and she also says, I want some silver. And sometimes students say, well, she's materialistic, but I think she just means she wants a house. She wants
Mhm.
a domestic situation like her mother had, where everything's traditional and I don't have to go from hotel to hotel. And I've got a family and some nice dishes and some paintings and all of that.
This is the typical security kind of, it sounds like too, um,
Right.
rather than kind of this nomadic lifestyle.
Mhm.
Okay, so apart from these, then what other kind of like subtle symbols in this story point to the idea that we were just talking about, that this modern life, in this case, the jazz age, is not as ideal as maybe the characters were thinking or hoping.
Yeah, I think the bed is definitely one of those, with the man upside down in the bed, or and there's a whole kind of symbolic matrix of nature versus culture, and it's introduced in the first paragraph where Hemingway writes about there was a statue in a garden and it rained, and the artist would come and paint sometimes, but today it was raining so they couldn't. And
Mhm.
so I think he's setting up this whole idea of the natural thing to do versus the cultural thing to do. What society seems to be requiring you to do, and what is your natural human impulse to do. And I think he sort of plays with that back and forth throughout the story.
Yeah, that is interesting, for sure. And I think that's something that still goes on today. We talk about, modern life in terms of the time period that the story was written in, but that's still something I think that people run into all the time. We're always harkening back to simpler times, or, I think we see that continuously. We romanticize the past a little bit, for sure, but all the modern ideals, maybe some that we're living through or that we're trying to establish, aren't always the best for us or turn out to be. I think we romanticize both. We romanticize the past, or
Yeah.
also romanticizing like our present in a way with all these new innovations and trying to live this modern lifestyle. Sometimes we make it ideal in our minds, and then of course it can't really live up to that ideal probably.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like that movie Midnight in Paris, where Owen Wilson's character goes back to the 20s and he meets Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald, and he loves it and he wants to go back there all the time. And finally, at the end of the movie, one of the characters from the 20s says, "Oh, we always want to go back to the 1900s or something like that. We hate the 20s."
Yeah,
Which,
it's an interesting kind of concept.
Mhm.
All right. So moving on from the symbols of that story, the next story we wanted to talk about was Out of Season. So this is a great transition into this. How does this story reflect the notion that some members of the jazz age that Hemingway was a part of felt out of season?
Yeah, it's a great title, I think, for the way a lot of people felt at this time. And it's a story of a young couple who are going to go fishing, and it's not fishing season, so it's not legal to fish, but they have a guide who agrees to take them fishing anyway. I think they're in Italy, so they have a language barrier, but he's sort of a, a vagrant type who hangs around town, and he says, "I'll take you where the fish are," and all that. But it's a terrible day. It's cold and windy, and it's illegal anyway. And so what begins as a fun outing for this young husband and wife turns out to be pretty negative because nobody feels good about it. It's not a good day. They forget some of their fishing equipment, and the whole thing just sort of goes bad. And I think he's referring to that feeling that many people are said to have had in the 20s, where they felt like they were born at the wrong time, like this time didn't suit them. Kind of like you said, the young woman in the previous story felt like, I kind of wish I belonged to an earlier generation.
Yeah, that is interesting. I say that myself sometimes. I wish I lived in like the Mad Men era or something. Uh,
Yeah. Do you know what, Brandon? I read an article just the other day that said a lot of people think the 50s was the perfect time, but they went back and looked, and people in the 50s looked back to the 20s and 30s. They didn't, because they were worried about nuclear annihilation and things that we don't even, we forget were a problem then.
of course.
Um, and then, of course, they looked back, and I guess that's just human nature.
It sounds like it. Yeah. How do we reconcile this?
Yeah.
Interesting. So then on top of that, then how does Out of Season also um, show Hemingway's masculinity and also his sensitivity? He's very known for being this like man's man. It's almost a
Yeah.
cliche image now of Hemingway with the big beard and a gun and
Yeah.
a safari and a bull and all of the stuff. How does this show that side, but also again his sensitivity as a person?
Yeah, I think he does that symbolically through the lead. That's what the character, the man in the story, has forgotten is the lead, the sinker for the tackle. Like, it looks like he got the bobber, and he got the hooks, and he got the bait, but forgot the lead, which I think symbolizes like weight and ballast and manhood in this story. And the guide says, "You don't have any lead?" He's like, "I forgot the lead."
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh. So I think that's how he does that. And again, Hemingway showing where maybe the man is lacking something and is contributing to the problem in this relationship.
Okay,
So
yeah.
I think again, our sympathies are with the woman in the story more than the man.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point because again, it goes back to like the first story that we talked about, and his Hemingway's portrayal of women and just kind of the reputation he's gotten. But that is an interesting perspective for sure. Um, okay, so lastly, then the last story we wanted to discuss out of this collection is called Cross Country Snow. So we discussed Hemingway's like masculinity, his relationship with religion, women, the war, things like that. But then what makes this like an emotional story? Why is this one of Hemingway's saddest stories?
Hmm.
Because it is
Yeah,
kind of sad.
yeah. It's a buddy story, um, involving something that Hemingway loved to do, which is snow ski, and he had the opportunity to ski in the Alps, which I think would be so fun.
Yeah.
But he and his friend are skiing in the Alps, and they stop at a little pub or restaurant there nearby, and he notices that the waitress is pregnant, and it reminds him, oh yeah, my wife is also pregnant. And it's and the whole story sort of turns sad. And he says, is it killing you, Nick? And he says, not exactly. So he doesn't say, no, I'm excited about it, I can't wait to have my child. So you get the feeling the fun is over.
Right.
He's going to have to be an adult now.
Yes. Do you think that's interesting because, in the first story, Nick breaks up with his girlfriend and says it's not fun anymore. And you just said like the fun is kind of over here as well. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like, does this demonstrate the idea that Hemingway himself might have had this kind of arrested development because Nick is not excited? He's not, going on to this next chapter of his life in the story, or is not seemingly not enthused about it. So, did Hemingway have similar feelings in his life, or?
You kind of get that feeling that maybe he did, that he loved to do boy things. He loved to hunt and fish and play sports and box and all of these things. And it kind of reminds me when my son first got a girlfriend. He went to the park and he came back home and said, how did it go? And he said, the thing about having a girlfriend is you have to do things you wouldn't normally do, like walk in the park. And I thought that was so funny. It's so true.
Yeah.
But you have to do that in any relationship because it's no longer just about you and whatever you want to do. You have to bend your will and do things for the other person.
Mhm.
And I think that was always difficult for Hemingway to reconcile that kind of thing, and maybe why he had 4 different wives, because he kept looking for someone whose goals and ideas of fun matched up exactly with his. And maybe his last wife was the closest that he had because they went big game hunting all the time and fishing. And
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna ask who you thought maybe fit that mold the best. So that's perfect with his last wife then. Um, okay, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Um, did you have anything else that you wanted to speak on about Hemingway that we hadn't discussed yet, or because those are that's kind of the last story that I had to discuss.
Yeah. I think there is more to come as we discuss the rest of the book, but I don't know if people there in your area realize how close they are to a great Hemingway Museum in Piggott, Arkansas, which is only about 4 hours away from you there, just right down Highway 60, you go through Poplar Bluff. And that was the home of his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, who they were a rich Catholic family there in Piggott, and Hemingway wrote in the barn on the property, wrote Farewell to Arms there, and the Arkansas State University purchased that whole property and refurbished it and turned it into a really nice museum devoted to Hemingway. It's called the Hemingway Pfeiffer Museum.
Mhm.
And they've kind of tried to turn the whole town into a Hemingway shrine in a way. And the reason I know about it is because my dad was born in Piggott, Arkansas.
Okay.
And supposedly my grandpa hunted with Hemingway when he was there. I have since learned that everybody in Piggott has hunted with Ernest Hemingway.
Sure, they have, yeah, some kind of
Yeah. And we stayed in a little a rented house one time when we were there, and there was a little sideboard piece of furniture, and it had a glass stain on it, and they told us that's from Hemingway's glass. It's like every house in Piggott has one of those. But
Yes.
anyway, that's a nice museum, and I have a connection to it. My cousin lives right across the street, and my grandparents live right down the road. So
Yeah. I'm
personal
glad that
connection.
you brought that up. That's great. We'll include information about Piggott and this museum at the end of our video. I have also been there and have visited this museum, and it's an excellent, excellent resource, I think, for people who are interested in Hemingway. Very well kept and lots of cool information. The barn has been um, redone and set up the way Hemingway probably had it while he was there. So it's a pretty cool place
Yeah.
for sure.
And I've tried to go to every Hemingway house, and I saw the house where he shot himself in Ketchum, Idaho. Even though you're not supposed to go back there, there's a sign that says no trespassing through this neighborhood, but I went anyway. And so
Ah,
yeah,
yeah.
I think it's a lot more fun than a traditional vacation if you can squeeze in some literary history. I know
100% agree. Great. Well, Dr. Blake, thank you again for joining us today. You helped us learn a lot more about Hemingway as a writer and a person, and hopefully for some of our patrons who may have been interested in Hemingway to kind of get this taste of him as a writer and in his personal life. So if you're, as a patron, if you're more interested, or if you're interested in more information about Ernest Hemingway, you can check out the following resources available through Christian County Library. And then also remember to tune into the 3-part, 6-hour documentary called Hemingway on PBS, which premieres April 5th, 6th, and 7th across 3 nights. So thank you again, Dr. Blake. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun, Brandon. I appreciate
Yeah.
you having me.
Yes, it was great. Thank you.